The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport when David Thompson gently shook his daughter's shoulder. "Hey, sunshine, we're here," he whispered softly. 8-year-old Lily had been sleeping against his arm for the past hour, her small body curled up in the uncomfortable plastic chair of the departure lounge. Lily opened her eyes slowly, blinking a few times before remembering where they were. The colorful butterfly headscarf she wore shifted slightly as she sat up, revealing just a hint of her bald head underneath. She had picked out that particular scarf herself from the hospital gift shop 3 weeks ago, saying it made her feel like she could fly away from all the scary medical stuff. "Are we really going on an airplane, Daddy?" she asked, her voice still, heavy with sleep, but filled with excitement. Despite everything she had been through in the past 6 months, Lily still found wonder in the smallest things. It was one of the qualities that kept David going during the darkest moments of their journey. David smiled and nodded, brushing a gentle hand across her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. In just a little while, we'll be flying through the clouds to Memphis. Remember what I told you about the special doctors there?" Lily's face lit up. "The ones who help kids like me get better." "That's right, baby girl. The ones who help kids like you get better." The truth was, David had been waiting for this moment for months. When Lily was first diagnosed with leukemia 6 months ago, their world had turned upside down in an instant. One day she was a normal, energetic second grader who loved to dance and paint pictures. The next day, they were sitting in a sterile hospital room while a doctor explained words like chemotherapy, treatment protocols, and survival rates. David had thrown himself into research, spending countless sleepless nights reading medical journals and connecting with other parents in online support groups. That's when he first heard about the groundbreaking clinical trial at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis. It was experimental, but the early results were promising. More importantly, it offered hope when their local doctors had started using phrases like limited options. Getting Lily accepted into the program had been a battle in itself. There were countless forms, medical records to transfer, insurance companies to fight with, and a waiting list that seemed impossible to get on. David had made phone calls, written letters, and even reached out to his old medical school connections. He hadn't practiced medicine in years, not since Lily's mother had died in a car accident when Lily was just 2 years old. After that, he had left his promising career as a surgeon to focus entirely on raising his daughter. The breakthrough came 3 weeks ago when Dr. Patricia Williams from St. Jude personally called to tell them that a spot had opened up in the trial. David had cried right there on the phone, not caring that he was standing in the middle of the grocery store. Lily had been getting her weekly blood work done that same day, and when they got the news, she had jumped up and down in the hospital hallway, her IV pole rolling along beside her like a dance partner. "Daddy, look at all the people," Lily said now, pointing toward the busy terminal around them. Even at this early hour, the airport was bustling with travelers heading to destinations all over the world. Business people in suits hurried past with their rolling luggage, families with young children struggled with car seats and diaper bags, and elderly couples moved slowly hand in hand toward their gates. David followed her gaze and smiled. Everyone's going somewhere special today, just like us. They had arrived at the airport 3 hours early, partly because David was nervous about missing their flight, but mostly because he wanted Lily to have time to take everything in. This was her first time flying, and despite the circumstances that brought them here, he wanted it to be magical for her. The past 6 months had stolen so much from her childhood. Hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions that left her sick for days, missed school, missed birthday parties, missed everything that 8-year-old girls should be doing. But today, for just a few hours, she could be excited about something new and wonderful. "Can we get something to eat, Daddy?" "I'm hungry," Lily said, tugging on his sleeve. David checked his watch. They still had 2 hours before their flight, and Lily's appetite had been better lately, which was a good sign. "What sounds good to you, sunshine?" "Pancakes," she said without hesitation. "With lots of syrup." David laughed. Before she got sick, Lily had been a picky eater who usually preferred fruits and vegetables. But the chemotherapy had changed her taste buds, and now she craved sweet things constantly. The doctor said it was normal and encouraged him to let her eat whatever appealed to her as long as she was eating. They gathered their carry-on bags and made their way through the terminal toward the food court. David kept one hand on Lily's shoulder, not because he was worried about losing her in the crowd, but because he needed the constant reassurance that she was there, that she was okay, that they were really doing this. The flight tickets in his jacket pocket had cost more than David made in 2 months at his current job driving delivery trucks. He had worked extra shifts, sold his guitar and his watch, and even accepted money from his brother despite his pride telling him not to. But when the charity organization Wings of Hope had contacted him about covering the cost of first-class seats, he had almost broken down crying again. The representative had explained that children undergoing cancer treatment often needed the extra space and comfort that first class provided, especially on longer flights. The seats were bigger, the air circulation was better, and the flight attendants were trained to be more attentive to passengers with medical needs. It seemed like a miracle, and David had learned to believe in miracles lately. As they walked through the terminal, Lily's energy was infectious. She pointed out everything she saw, from the planes visible through the windows to the shops filled with souvenirs and snacks. Her enthusiasm reminded David of the little girl she had been before cancer entered their lives, and it gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be that little girl again. "Daddy, will the airplane be scary?" she asked as they sat down at a small restaurant that served breakfast all day. David reached across the table and took her small hand in his. "You know what? I think it's going to be the most amazing thing you've ever experienced. We're going to be flying above the clouds, and you'll be able to see the whole world spread out below us like a giant map." Lily's eyes grew wide with wonder. "Will we see our house?" "Maybe," David said, though he knew they wouldn't be able to see anything that specific from that height. "But we'll definitely see mountains and rivers and forests. It's going to be beautiful." As they waited for their food to arrive, David couldn't help but think about how much their lives had changed. 6 months ago, his biggest worry was whether Lily was doing okay in school and if he should sign her up for soccer or dance lessons. Now he measured time in treatment cycles and blood counts, and every day was a gift. But looking at her now, wearing her butterfly scarf and chattering excitedly about flying, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Whatever happened in Memphis, whatever the doctor said about the trial, whatever the future held, they would face it together. And for today, they were just a father and daughter going on an adventure. The pancakes arrived steaming hot, and Lily dug in with enthusiasm. David watched her eat, grateful for every bite, every smile, every moment of normalness in their complicated world. Soon, they would be boarding that plane, flying toward hope, flying toward a chance at the future they both desperately wanted. Neither of them had any idea that their journey was about to become much more complicated than they ever imagined. The boarding announcement echoed through Gate B12 as David and Lily gathered their belongings. Now boarding all passengers with special assistance and first-class tickets for Flight 447 to Memphis. Lily bounced on her toes with excitement, her butterfly scarf catching the light from the large windows. "That's us, Daddy. That's us," David double-checked their boarding passes one more time, still hardly believing they were real. The thick cardstock felt substantial in his hands, and the words, "First Class, Seat 2A and 2B" were printed clearly across the top. He had memorized every detail of those tickets over the past 3 weeks, afraid that somehow they might disappear or turn out to be a mistake. "Okay, sunshine. Let's go," he said, taking Lily's hand as they joined the small line of first-class passengers. As they walked down the jet bridge, Lily peppered him with questions. "Will there be movies on the airplane? Can I look out the window the whole time? Do you think the flight attendants will be nice like the nurses at the hospital?" David answered each question patiently, though his mind was focused on making sure everything went smoothly. The past 6 months had taught him to expect complications, to have backup plans for backup plans. But he was determined that nothing would ruin this experience for Lily. The airplane was bigger than Lily had imagined. Her eyes grew wide as they stepped through the door and saw the spacious first-class cabin with its large leather seats and warm lighting. "Wow," she whispered, unconsciously gripping David's hand tighter. The flight attendant at the entrance, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and arpy blue eyes, looked up from her tablet as they approached. Her smile was practiced and professional, but it faltered slightly when she saw David and Lily. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a tone that made David's stomach tighten. "I think you might be lost. The main cabin is that way." She pointed toward the back of the plane without even glancing at their boarding passes. David felt his face grow warm, but he kept his voice calm and polite. "Actually, we're in the right place. These are our seats." He held out their boarding passes, making sure she could clearly see the first-class designation. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Crystal, took the boarding passes but barely looked at them. Instead, she studied David and Lily with obvious skepticism. Her gaze lingered on Lily's headscarf and David's simple jeans and sweater, clearly not what she expected from first-class passengers. Crystal said, holding the boarding passes up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "These look unusual. Are you sure these weren't meant for a different flight?" David felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He had encountered this kind of treatment before, subtle but unmistakable. The assumption that he didn't belong, that there must be some mistake. "I'm quite sure," he said firmly. "We're flying to Memphis for my daughter's medical treatment." Crystal's eyebrows rose and she looked at Lily again, this time with even more obvious judgment. "Medical treatment? In first class? That seems unlikely." Other passengers were beginning to back up behind them, and David could feel their eyes on his back. He heard someone clear their throat impatiently and another passenger muttered something under their breath. Lily tugged on David's sleeve. "Daddy, why is she being mean to us?" The innocence in his daughter's question hit David like a punch to the chest. Crystal overheard and her expression hardened further. "I'm not being mean, sweetie," Crystal said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm just doing my job. Sometimes people get confused about where they're supposed to sit." David took a deep breath, fighting to keep his composure. "We are not confused. These are our seats, paid for by Wings of Hope charity organization. If you need to verify that, you can call them, but we belong here." Crystal handed the boarding passes back to David, but her skeptical expression didn't change. "Wings of Hope? I've never heard of them. Are you sure this isn't some kind of mix-up? Maybe someone gave you the wrong tickets by mistake?" "There's no mistake," David said, his voice getting firmer despite his efforts to stay calm. "My daughter is a cancer patient traveling for treatment. This charity specifically helps families like ours." "Cancer?" Crystal said the word like she didn't quite believe it. "She doesn't look sick to me." The comment hung in the air like a slap. David felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. Behind him, he heard an elderly woman gasp softly. "Not all illnesses are visible," David said through gritted teeth. "And frankly, it's not your place to judge my daughter's medical condition." Crystal shrugged. "Look, I'm just saying that we get a lot of people trying to upgrade themselves illegally. It happens all the time. Maybe you should just take your seats in economy where you belong and we can sort this out after we're in the air." "Where we belong," David repeated, his voice rising slightly despite his best efforts. Lily pressed closer to his side, and he could feel her trembling. "Daddy, I don't like this lady," she whispered. Crystal apparently heard her because she rolled her eyes. "There's no need to turn your daughter against me. I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to help passengers, not interrogate them," said a voice from behind them. David turned to see an older gentleman in an expensive suit who had been waiting patiently in line. "These people have boarding passes for first class. What exactly is the problem?" Crystal's cheeks flushed slightly, but she stood her ground. "The problem is that these tickets look suspicious and I have every right to verify passenger credentials." "They look suspicious because they're for black passengers?" the elderly man asked pointedly. The question hung in the air, and David saw Crystal's mouth open and closed like a fish out of water. Around them, the other passengers had grown very quiet, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unsure how to react. "That's not—" "I never said," Crystal stammered, then collected herself. "This has nothing to do with race. This is about proper documentation and following procedures." "What procedures?" David asked. "What procedure requires you to question the validity of boarding passes issued by your own airline?" Crystal looked around nervously, clearly realizing that the situation was escalating beyond what she had intended. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. "Look, I'm going to need to call my supervisor to verify these tickets," she announced loudly, pulling out her phone. "Until then, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside and let the other passengers board." David felt his heart sink. This was exactly what he had been afraid of. The last thing he wanted was to create a scene that would upset Lily or delay their flight. But he also couldn't let this woman's discrimination stand unchallenged. "Fine," he said quietly. "Call your supervisor, but we're not moving to the back of the plane, and we're not giving up our seats." Crystal punched numbers into her phone with more force than necessary. As she waited for someone to answer, she kept glancing at David and Lily with obvious irritation. "Yes, this is Crystal in first class on flight 447, she said when someone picked up. "I have a situation here with some passengers who have questionable tickets." "Yes, I'll hold." David put his arm around Lily's shoulders, feeling her lean into him for comfort. He could see the confusion and hurt in her eyes, and it broke his heart. This was supposed to be an exciting adventure for her, not another reminder that the world could be cruel and unfair. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" Lily asked quietly. "No, baby," David whispered back. "We didn't do anything wrong at all." As they stood there waiting, David noticed that several other passengers were watching the situation with obvious discomfort. Some looked sympathetic, while others seemed annoyed at the delay. A few were actually pulling out their phones, and David realized with growing dread that this confrontation was being recorded. Crystal finished her phone call and hung up with a satisfied expression. "My supervisor will be here in just a few minutes to sort this out," she announced. "Until then, I really do need you to step aside so the other passengers can board." David looked down at Lily, who was clutching her small backpack tightly and staring at the floor. This wasn't how their journey was supposed to begin, but he knew that backing down now would send the wrong message to his daughter about standing up for what's right. "We'll wait right here," he said firmly. "In first class, where we belong." Crystal's smile was cold and triumphant. "We'll see about that," she said. Neither of them realized that among the passengers recording the confrontation was someone whose presence would change everything. But for now, David and Lily stood their ground, surrounded by strangers and facing down discrimination that should have been unthinkable in 2024. The real confrontation was just beginning. The supervisor who arrived 5 minutes later was a tall, thin man with a permanent scowl named Kevin Rodriguez. Crystal immediately launched into her version of events, speaking in hushed tones but gesturing obviously toward David and Lily. "So you can see the problem," Crystal concluded loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "These tickets just don't seem legitimate. I mean, look at them." Kevin studied the boarding passes with exaggerated care, turning them over multiple times and holding them up to the light. David watched this performance with growing anger, knowing exactly what was happening, but feeling powerless to stop it. Yes, I see what you mean," Kevin said, though David was certain there was nothing unusual about their tickets. "These charity tickets can be problematic. We've had issues before with fake documentation." "Fake documentation?" David said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "These tickets were issued directly by your airline through an established charity program. You can verify this with a simple phone call." Kevin shrugged dismissively. "These charity programs get complicated. Sometimes there are mix-ups. People get tickets who aren't supposed to have them. It happens more than you'd think." Lily tugged on David's shirt. "Daddy, why are they being so mean? Did we do something bad?" Her voice was getting shaky, and David could see tears forming in her eyes. This was exactly what he had been afraid of. The stress and confusion were too much for an 8-year-old to handle, especially one who had already been through so much. "No, sweetheart, we didn't do anything wrong," David said, kneeling down to her level. "Some people just make mistakes sometimes." Crystal overheard and scoffed. "Mistakes? The only mistake here is someone thinking they could sneak into first class with questionable tickets." "Questionable?" David stood up quickly, his patience finally reaching its limit. "What exactly is questionable about them? The seat numbers, the flight information, the airline logo, or is it just questionable because we don't look like who you think should be sitting in first class?" Kevin stepped between them, holding up his hands. "Now let's all just calm down. No need to make this about something it's not." "Something it's not," said the elderly gentleman who had spoken up earlier. "I've been flying first class for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone tickets scrutinized like this. What exactly makes these tickets more suspicious than anyone else's?" Other passengers were starting to murmur among themselves. David could hear fragments of their conversations. "This is ridiculous. Just let them sit down. I'm going to miss my connection." But Crystal seemed energized by the attention rather than embarrassed by it. "Look, I don't make the rules," she announced to the growing crowd. "When something doesn't look right, I have to investigate. That's just how it works." "What doesn't look right?" asked a middle-aged woman in a business suit. "They have boarding passes just like everyone else." Crystal's face flushed, but she doubled down. "It's not just the tickets, it's the whole situation. I mean, a charity paying for first-class seats for someone who doesn't even look sick? It just doesn't add up." The comment about Lily not looking sick hit David like a physical blow. He had heard this before from well-meaning but ignorant people who expected cancer patients to look like they did in movies, visibly wasting away and obviously ill. "My daughter is undergoing chemotherapy," David said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She's traveling for experimental treatment that could save her life. She's 8 years old and she's been through more medical procedures in the past 6 months than most adults face in a lifetime. The fact that she doesn't look sick enough for you is actually a testament to her strength and her doctor's skill." Several passengers made sympathetic noises, and David saw more than one person wipe their eyes. But Crystal remained unmoved. "Look, I'm sure that's all very sad," she said with obvious insincerity. "But I still need proper verification of these tickets. Until then, I really do need you to move to the economy section." "We're not moving," David said firmly. "These are our seats and we're not giving them up because you've decided we don't belong here." Kevin pulled out his radio. "Security to gate B12, please. Security to gate B12. The word security sent a chill through the cabin. Several passengers gasped, and David felt his heart start racing. This was escalating far beyond what anyone could have imagined. "Security?" said the elderly gentleman. "You're calling security on a sick child and her father because you don't like their boarding passes?" "I'm calling security because these passengers are refusing to cooperate with airline personnel," Kevin replied smoothly. Lily was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her cheeks. The stress of the confrontation combined with the fatigue from her treatments was overwhelming her small body. David picked her up, feeling how light she had become since starting chemotherapy. "Shh, baby. It's okay," he whispered in her ear. "We're going to Memphis just like we planned. Don't let these mean people scare you." "I want to go home," Lily sobbed into his shoulder. "I don't want to fly anymore." David's heart broke hearing those words. This trip represented hope, possibly, their only chance at a treatment that could save her life. But Crystal and Kevin were turning it into a nightmare. "Look what you've done," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've terrified a sick child because you can't accept that we have the right to be here." Crystal actually rolled her eyes. "Oh, please don't try to guilt-trip me. Kids cry on airplanes all the time." The callousness of her response shocked even Kevin, who shot her a warning look. But the damage was done. Several passengers began speaking up at once. "This is absolutely disgusting," said the woman in the business suit. "Someone needs to report this," added another passenger. "I'm recording everything," announced a young man with his phone out. "This is going straight to social media." Crystal's confidence wavered for the first time when she heard about the recording. "You can't record me without permission," she said nervously. "Actually, I can," the young man replied. "We're in a public space, and this is newsworthy. This is exactly the kind of discrimination that needs to be exposed." David noticed several other passengers had their phones out as well. Part of him was grateful that there would be evidence of what was happening, but another part of him worried about Lily being thrust into the spotlight when she was already so vulnerable. The security officers arrived just as the situation reached a boiling point. Two uniformed men in their 40s approached the group with serious expressions. "What seems to be the problem here?" asked the taller of the two officers. Kevin immediately launched into his explanation, painting David and Lily as troublemakers who were disrupting the flight with invalid tickets. Crystal nodded along, adding her own embellishments about their suspicious behavior and refusal to cooperate. David waited for them to finish, then calmly presented the security officers with their boarding passes, the charity organization's documentation, and Lily's medical records showing her treatment schedule. "As you can see," David said, "everything is completely legitimate. We're traveling to Memphis for my daughter's cancer treatment, and our first-class seats were provided by a recognized charity organization that works directly with this airline." The security officers examined the documentation carefully. David could see the confusion on their faces as they found nothing wrong with any of the paperwork. "These all look legitimate to me," said the shorter officer, handing the documents back to David. "But you don't understand," Crystal protested. "They just don't seem like first-class passengers. I mean, look at them." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Even Kevin looked uncomfortable now, realizing that Crystal had just said out loud what they had both been thinking. "Look at them how?" asked the taller security officer, his voice stern. Crystal realized she had stepped over a line, but it was too late to take the words back. "I just meant their clothes and what?" pressed the officer. Crystal's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Around them, the other passengers watched in stunned silence as the ugly truth of the situation became impossible to deny. David held Lily closer, feeling her small body shaking with exhaustion and stress. This was supposed to be the beginning of their journey toward hope, but instead, it had become a public humiliation that his daughter would never forget. What none of them knew was that among the passengers recording this confrontation was someone who had the power to change everything. But for now, they were still trapped in a nightmare of discrimination and cruelty that seemed to have no end in sight. The security officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed with a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control, though tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. David held Lily close while she continued to cry softly into his shoulder, her small body trembling from exhaustion and stress. The security officers stood awkwardly between David and the airline employees, clearly uncomfortable with the situation they had walked into. "So let me get this straight," said the taller security officer, looking directly at Crystal. "You're saying these passengers don't belong in first class because of how they look?" Crystal's face went white as she realized the implications of what she had said. I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" asked the shorter officer. Before Crystal could answer, a voice spoke up from the back of the first-class section. "Excuse me, officers. I think I might be able to help clarify the situation here." Everyone turned to see a distinguished-looking man in his 50s rising from seat 1A. He was wearing an expensive charcoal suit and had the kind of presence that commanded attention. David noticed that he had been quietly observing the entire confrontation from the beginning, but this was the first time he had spoken. "And you are?" asked the taller security officer. The man smiled and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a business card and a company ID badge. "My name is Richard Blake, and I'm the CEO of Skyline Airways." The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. Crystal's face went from white to green, and Kevin took an involuntary step backward. Even the security officers looked surprised. "Mr. Blake," Kevin stammered. "I had no idea you were on this flight. If you had known I was," Here, you would have treated these passengers differently? Blake asked, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. That's interesting because it suggests you know exactly how wrong this situation is. David felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. Of all the people who could have witnessed this discrimination, it was the CEO of the airline itself. It seemed too good to be true. Blake walked over to David and Lily, his expression softening when he saw the little girl's tear-stained face. "Hello there, sweetheart. I'm Richard. What's your name?" Lily peeked out from David's shoulder, still sniffling. "Lily," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name," Blake said gently. "And you're going to Memphis for treatment, is that right?" Lily nodded, and Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. David could see the anger building behind the CEO's professional demeanor. Blake turned back to Crystal and Kevin, and when he spoke, his voice was ice cold. "So let me understand what I've just witnessed. A sick child and her father board this aircraft with legitimate first-class tickets, purchased through one of our established charity partnerships, and instead of welcoming them aboard, you subjected them to interrogation, humiliation, and intimidation." "Sir, we were just following protocol," Kevin said weakly. "Protocol?" Blake's voice rose slightly, causing several passengers to lean forward. "What protocol are? Requires you to question the legitimacy of boarding passes issued by our own reservation system? What protocol allows you to make a cancer patient prove she's sick enough to deserve her seat?" Crystal tried to speak up. "Mr. Blake, you don't understand. Sometimes these charity tickets—" "Are you about to tell me there's something wrong with our charity partnership program?" Blake interrupted. "Because I personally approved the Wings of Hope initiative. I know exactly how it works, and I know exactly what those tickets should look like." Blake pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "This is Richard Blake. I need you to pull up the reservation for David and Lily Thompson on Flight 447 to Memphis." "Yes, I'll hold." While he waited, Blake looked around the cabin at the other passengers, many of whom still had their phones out recording the exchange. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for what you've witnessed today. This is not representative of Skyline Airways' values or policies." His phone buzzed with a text message and he read it quickly. "Just as I thought," he said, showing the screen to the security officers. "David and Lily Thompson, first-class seats 2A and 2B, paid for by Wings of Hope charity organization. Reservation confirmed 3 weeks ago. Special assistance noted for pediatric cancer patient. Everything completely legitimate and properly documented." He turned back to Crystal and Kevin, his anger now barely contained. "So perhaps one of you can explain to me what possible justification you had for putting this family through this ordeal." Kevin looked at Crystal, clearly hoping she would take the lead in explaining their actions. But Crystal seemed to have lost the ability to speak coherently. Sometimes people try to—" she started, then stopped, realizing that any explanation would only make things worse. "Sometimes people try to what?" Blake pressed. "Sneak into first class by forging boarding passes issued by our own airline. Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds?" One of the passengers who had been recording spoke up. "Mr. Blake, I want you to know that your employee specifically said these passengers didn't look like they belonged in first class. She questioned whether the little girl was actually sick because she didn't look sick enough." Blake's expression darkened further. "Is that true?" he asked Crystal directly. Crystal's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She looked around desperately for support, but even Kevin had stepped away from her. I didn't mean," she started, but Blake held up his hand. "I've heard enough," he said firmly. He turned to the security officers. "Gentlemen, I need Crystal escorted off this aircraft immediately. Her employment with Skyline Airways is terminated effective immediately." Crystal's face went completely white. "You can't fire me. I was just doing my job." "Your job was to welcome passengers aboard and ensure their comfort," Blake replied coldly. "Instead, you racially profiled a cancer patient and her father, subjected them to public humiliation, and violated every principle this company stands for. You're not just fired, you're banned from ever working for this airline again." The security officers moved toward Crystal, who suddenly seemed to realize the full consequences of her actions. Please, Mr. Blake, I need this job. I have bills. You should have thought about that before you decided to terrorize a sick child, Blake said without sympathy. Officers, please escort her off the plane. As Crystal was led away, her protests echoing down the jet bridge, Blake turned his attention to Kevin. As for you, you'll be facing a full investigation. Suspending you pending review would be letting you off easy. Kevin nodded miserably, clearly understanding that his career was likely over as well. Blake then addressed the cabin full of passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally ensure that the rest of your flight will be comfortable and pleasant. The crew will be taking extra care of all passengers today, and I'll be personally following up to make sure incidents like this never happen again. He turned back to David and Lily, his expression softening again. Mr. Thompson, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for what you and your daughter have endured today. This is absolutely not the Skyline Airways experience, and it's certainly not how we treat families dealing with medical crises. David shifted Lily to one arm and extended his hand. Thank you, Mr. Blake. I have to admit, I wasn't sure how this was going to end. Blake shook his hand firmly. It's ending with you and Lily getting to Memphis safely and comfortably, exactly as it should have from the beginning. And it's ending with meaningful changes to our training and policies to ensure this never happens to another family. Lily had stopped crying and was watching Blake with curious eyes. Are you the boss of the airplane? She asked. Blake smiled genuinely for the first time. I'm the boss of the whole company, sweetheart, and I want to make sure you have the best flight possible. Would you like to meet the pilots before we take off? Lily's eyes lit up and she nodded enthusiastically. For the first time since boarding, she looked excited rather than scared. Blake gestured to one of the remaining flight attendants. Rebecca, would you please escort Lily and her father to the cockpit and make sure they have everything they need for the remainder of the flight? As they prepared to move toward the front of the plane, Blake pulled David aside. I meant what I said about following up. I'd like to stay in touch about Lily's treatment, and I want to make sure Skyline Airways can support your family in any way possible. David felt tears in his eyes, but for the first time that day, they were tears of gratitude rather than frustration. Thank you, Mr. Blake. You have no idea what this means to us. Blake squeezed David's shoulder. Actually, I think I do, and I promise you this story isn't over. Good things are going to come from this terrible experience. As David and Lily headed toward the cockpit, the other passengers broke into spontaneous applause. What had started as a nightmare was finally beginning to feel like the hopeful journey it was supposed to be. But neither David nor Blake knew just how far-reaching the consequences of this incident would be, or how many lives would be changed by what had happened on Flight 447 that day. 3 hours later, as Flight 447 began its descent into Memphis, Lily was fast asleep in her father's arms, finally peaceful after the morning's ordeal. The spacious, first-class seat had allowed her to curl up comfortably, and the gentle hum of the engines had lulled her into much-needed rest. David looked out the window at the city growing larger below them, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. Despite the terrible way their journey had begun, they were finally here. In just a few hours they would be walking into St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, where Lily would begin the experimental treatment that could save her life. Richard, Blake approached their seats quietly, not wanting to wake Lily. How is she doing? He asked softly. Much better, David replied. Meeting the pilots really turned her day around. She spent the whole first hour of the flight asking Captain Wilson about how airplanes work. Blake smiled. Captain Wilson has grandchildren Lily's age. He was probably just as excited to meet her as she was to meet him. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, Blake sat down in the empty seat across from David. I wanted to talk to you before we reach the gate, he said. What happened today is going to have consequences far beyond just Crystal losing her job. David looked at him curiously. What do you mean? Well, for starters, several passengers recorded the entire incident. By the time we land, those videos will probably be all over social media. This is going to be a very public story. David felt a knot of worry in his stomach. I don't want Lily to become some kind of viral sensation. She's Been through enough. I understand your concern, Blake said, but I think this story needs to be told, not to exploit what happened to you, but to make sure it never happens to another family. Sometimes change only comes when people see the truth of what's happening. As if on cue, Blake's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at it and his eyebrows rose. The video from passenger Michael Chen has already been viewed over 1 million times in the past 3 hours. The hashtag Justice for Lily is trending nationwide. David was speechless. He had never imagined that their private humiliation would become such a public story. Blake continued, "The response has been overwhelming. Thousands of people are sharing their own stories of discrimination, and there's a massive outpouring of support for your family. More importantly, there are demands for systemic changes in how airlines handle situations like this." The plane came to a stop at the gate, and the fasten seatbelt sign turned off. Around them, passengers began gathering their belongings, but many stopped to speak with David before leaving. The elderly gentleman who had first spoken up during the confrontation approached their seats. "I just wanted you to know that I've never been more ashamed of how someone was treated," he said. "But I've also never been more proud of how you handled yourself under such terrible circumstances." The woman in the business suit shook David's hand. "I've already contacted my company's legal department. We want to make a significant donation to Wings of Hope to help other families like yours." One by one, nearly every passenger in first class stopped to offer words of support, contact information for potential help, or simply to wish Lily well in her treatment. David was overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers who had witnessed their ordeal. As they prepared to leave the plane, Blake handed David a business card with his personal cell phone number. "I meant what I said about staying in touch. I want to know how Lily's treatment goes, and I want to make sure our company does everything possible to support your family." "Mr. Blake," David said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today." "You don't need to thank me," Blake replied. "What I did was basic human decency. What Crystal did was unconscionable, and I'm just sorry it happened on my airline." They walked together through the jet bridge where David was surprised to see a small crowd of people waiting, airport staff, charity representatives from Wings of Hope, and even some local news reporters had gathered to greet them. Nancy Foster, the director of Wings of Hope, approached them with tears in her eyes. "David, Lily, I am so incredibly sorry for what happened to you today. When Mr. Blake called to tell us what occurred, we were horrified." "It's not your fault," David assured her. "You've been amazing to our family. We've already reached out to every airline we work with to review their training procedures." Nancy continued, "This will never happen to another family in our program." As they made their way through the airport, David noticed that several people recognized them from the viral video. Most offered words of encouragement, but a few asked for selfies or interviews. David politely declined the media requests, focusing on getting Lily to the hospital. By the time they reached St. Jude Children's Research Hospital later that afternoon, the story had exploded across national news. David's phone had been buzzing, constantly with calls from reporters, but he had ignored them all. His only focus was on Lily and her treatment. Dr. Patricia Williams, the lead researcher on Lily's treatment protocol, greeted them personally in the lobby. "I've been following your story today," she said. "I'm so sorry for what you went through, but I'm amazed by your grace under pressure." "All that matters now is Lily getting better," David replied. Dr. Williams knelt down to Lily's level. "Are you ready to start getting well, sweetheart?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. Despite the morning's trauma, she was excited to begin treatment that might cure her cancer. Over the following weeks, as Lily began her experimental therapy, the consequences of Flight 447 continued to ripple outward. Crystal was not only fired, but faced a civil rights investigation. Kevin was demoted and required to undergo extensive sensitivity training. More importantly, Skyline Airways implemented sweeping policy changes. All employees received mandatory bias training, and the company established a clear protocol for handling discrimination complaints. Richard Blake personally oversaw these changes, making it clear that such incidents would never be tolerated again. The viral video sparked a national conversation about racial bias in air travel. Other airlines voluntarily reviewed their own policies, and several introduced new training programs to prevent similar incidents. Meanwhile, the public support for Lily's family was overwhelming. A GoFundMe page set up by passengers from Flight 447 raised over $2 million for pediatric cancer research. Companies reached out to sponsor Lily's treatment, and celebrities shared her story to raise awareness about childhood cancer. Michael Chen, the passenger who had recorded the confrontation, used his platform as a social media influencer to advocate for airline policy reform. His follow-up videos about the incident reached tens of millions of people and sparked real change in the industry. 6 months later, Lily was in remission. The experimental treatment had worked better than anyone had dared hope, and her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. David was invited to speak at a conference about discrimination in travel, where he shared the stage with Richard Blake. Together, they announced the launch of the Lily Thompson Initiative, a program that would provide sensitivity training for airline employees and support for families facing medical crises. "What happened to us that day was terrible," David told the audience. "But what came from it has been extraordinary. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalysts for the most important changes." Lily, now 9 years old and with a full head of curly hair growing back, was in the audience wearing a t-shirt that read, "Every child deserves dignity." When her father finished his speech, she ran up on stage and hugged him tight. Richard Blake watched from the wings, thinking about how a routine business trip had turned into one of the most important days of his career. The discrimination that Lily and David had faced was inexcusable, but their response to it had inspired changes that would protect countless other families. As the applause died down, Lily took the microphone. In her sweet, clear voice, she said, "Thank you for making sure no other kids have to go through what I did. But also thank you for helping me get better. I'm going to be a doctor someday and help other kids like me." The audience erupted in applause, again, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. David picked up his daughter, marveling at how strong and resilient she had become. The little girl who had cried in terror on Flight 447 had grown into a confident young advocate who was already thinking about how she could help others. That evening, as they flew home to Atlanta in first class on Skyline Airways, Lily looked out the window at the clouds below. The flight attendant, a kind woman named Jennifer who had heard their story, had already stopped by 3 times to make sure they had everything they needed. "Daddy," Lily said, "do you think we would have met Mr. Blake if that mean lady hadn't been so mean to us?" David considered the question. "Probably not, sweetheart. Sometimes bad things happen so that good things can come from them." "I'm glad the good things happened," Lily said, "even if the bad thing was scary." David smiled and squeezed her hand. "Me too, baby girl. Me too." As their plane soared through the evening sky, David reflected on how much their lives had changed since that terrible morning 6 months ago. Lily was healthy, their family was financially secure for the first time in years, and they had become part of a movement that was making real change in the world. Most importantly, they had learned that even in the darkest moments, there were good people willing to stand up for what was right. The passengers who had spoken up, Richard Blake, who had acted with decisive justice, and the millions of strangers who had supported them, had proved that kindness and justice could triumph over prejudice and cruelty. Flight 447 had been the worst flight of their lives, but it had also been the beginning of something beautiful. And as Lily drifted off to sleep against her father's shoulder, David knew that their story was far from over. It was just the beginning of a lifetime of making sure that every child, regardless of their color or circumstances, would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved.